Good evening, everyone. World. Today happened to be the 17th of April, and this weekend, from over this weekend up until the 21st of April, you will have all kind of Rasta celebration, and in these celebration, you will be hearing the history repeat, rewrite, reinvent, and all you'll be hearing is the history being retold and retold and retold. I am here today to tell you that Rastafari as a movement, as it relates to Jamaica, is done. Yeah, man, I got pretty it up. It's done. Now, recently, I put out a podcast called Intellectual Traitor Amongst Us. And in that podcast, I pull out some documents and I attach 21 page of documents to that podcast. I have noted that nobody had took the time to look at the documents. So what I've done now, I have gotten the documents to be redone in audio form. That document was put out. That document was called the Rainbow Circle Throne Room of the Rastafari, a summary report on the Nyabingi mission to the Eastern United States between 1988 and 1991. That document was written by and compiled and submitted by Dr. Jakes Omiuk, Director of National Anthropological Archive, National Museum of National History, Smithsonian Institute, Washington, D.C., November 2nd, 1995. Now, the first question is, it is being said that Rasta no work for CIA. So now I want you to tell me if the Smithsonian is not a offshoot wing of the CIA. Now, since that documents have been put out, Rasta, as it relates to Jamaica, have been standstill and is all over themselves in denial, and nobody want to call a spade a spade. What I am going to do now is play the order of that document. And I'm going to ask you all now to listen carefully so you can decipher for yourself who the traitors are, who the sellout are, and what was done to Rasta by the Smithsonian. Here we go.
The Rainbow Circle Throne Room of Jarrastafari, a summary report on the Nyabingi missions to the eastern United States, 1988 to 1991. Written, compiled, and submitted by Dr. Jakes Homiak, Director, National Anthropological Archives, National Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian Institution, Washington, D.C., November 1995. February 1st, 1996. 2. Supreme Council, House of Nyabingi, Scots Pass, Nyabingi Centre, Scots Pass Postal Agency, Manchester, Jamaica. From James Homiak, Director, National Anthropological Archives, National Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian Institution, Washington, D.C., 20560. Trods of the Nyabingi elders to the eastern United States under the banner of the Rainbow Circle Throne Room of Jarrastafari. Rastafari greetings. One Ola, love in the house. Give thanks and praise unto the name of the living I, His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah. Give the judgment unto the King and righteousness unto his sons and daughters annually. 1. Statement of purpose. For some years now, it has been my intention to provide the House in general and the I symbol of elders in particular, which is now designated as the Supreme Council of Elders, with a formal report on the missions which travelled to the eastern US in 1988, 1989 and 1990. I offer this report as a humble remnant who has been privileged to have grounded with the elders since the Golden Jubilee year of 1980 and who Jah saw fit to assist the House in mounting its first official trod to the United States in 1988. This statement to the House is based on several concerns. I list them serially. A. Firstly, there is the issue of documenting the historical initiatives taken by the House in recent years and making this information accessible to as many brethren and sistren as possible. The need for such documentation derives from the accelerated pace with which the House has become a force in the internationalization of Rastafari, the principle of collective security notwithstanding individuals' course has traditionally been very cautious in its dealings with outsiders, and rightly so. I say this in full awareness of many labels have been applied to me in the course of my Rasta movements. These vary from brethren to sympathizer to pirate to CIA spy. For this reason, I have always conducted my affairs in full public view of the House and remain open to reasoning. It is most always the case that my moves to Jamaica are timed to coincide with Bingi celebrations in order to make myself accessible to the House. I regard myself as privileged to have moved within the inner circles of Rastafari. Not everything that is good to eat is good to speak. This communication is made in the same spirit, as well as in accordance with the principle of collective security, which has always guided I&I movements. Let me now turn to some of my own reflections on changes which I have witnessed over the past 15 years, as well as broader transformations which I have gleaned from reasoning with the elders. These comments provide a wider context for the documentation assembled in this report. 2. Movements of Jah people from stage to stage and strength to strength. Rastafari is a reality that has developed from stage to stage. Today, one often hears the elders remark, this is a different movement than in the days of Buckawal, Trenchtown or Warwicker Hill. In 1980, the year of the Golden Jubilee, when I first began the trod to the iris of the Bingi, there were still a handful of patriarchs within the house who could attest to having heard Marcus Garvey preach at Dog Park on Regent Street or in Kingston's Liberty Hall. Some had made regular visits to Pinnacle to participate in Leonard Howell's Ethiopian Salvation Society services. A larger cohort of elders still bear the living testimony of having carried the movement through the camp and yard period in Kingston. This period, when the culture was just developing up, marks the hottest battle fought by just soldiers. The dread sites in which brethren and sistren sustained one another, places like Dungle Bakawal, Aki Walk, Foreshore Road, Warwicker Hill, Waterhouse and Moonlight City, are now part of a legendary cultural geography. After the historic visit of the King in 1966, and after the Jamaican government destroyed the Rasta areas of Bakawal, Aki Walk and Foreshore Road in the mid-1960s, the House began sponsorship of all island assemblies held in sites like Steertown, Robbins Bay, 9 Miles Beach, Freeman's Hall, Lucky Valley, Willowfield, Sunny Hill, Guys Hill, Freetown, Round Hill, Portland Cottage, and Angel Heights. For decades, these and other sites of all island assembly have served to link the congregation in one unity. A new plateau was reached in the early 1980s through a series of international Rastafari assemblies held both inside and outside Jamaican reggae inside of Jamaica. Reggae, of course, played an important role in the initial spread of the message internationally. For the roots, however, it was the advent of the international Rastafari assemblies in the early 1980s that would carry things to the next stage. As the missions sponsored by the House have travelled abroad, there have been corresponding process by which Rastafari from foreign make their own pilgrimages to Jamaica to ground with the elders and ground with the House. Since the first international convention in 1982, Toronto, the Nyabingi House has accordingly become more and more an international community which embraces Rastafari from Toronto, Canada to Rocky Point, from Atlanta, Georgia to Hector's River, and from Washington, D.C. to Scotts Pass. In this process of internationalization, the elders of the Divine Order of the Nyabingi have assumed their rightful role as instruments of cultural upliftment and spiritual inspiration. However, it is also fair to say that the House is still in its infancy with respect to the new ambassadorial initiatives. Despite the principle of collective security, the House still lacks an effective means of bringing all its members equally into this process. The principle of each one teach one, for example, now applies at a new and more complex level, not merely to the elders and their charges in yard. In the governmental context of the House, it applies mutually to elders in Jamaica and to brethren and sistren outside Jamaica, many of whom are community activists and organisers, upon whom the elders rely for support in practical and administrative matters. This is the more complex kind of unity which requires the effective sharing of information. However, it is also true that some man push out them head more than others, while the same time influentialists within the House seek to control the composition and agendas of given missions abroad. The existing organisation of the House and the limits on information flow to all members is another reason why I have chosen to place this report with several of the elect of records. 3. Documenting the history, the internationalization of the House. The Elders' mission to the United States, which arrived in late April of 1988 and returned in August that year, was not the first international trod. In 1982, the House sent a mission to the Eastern Caribbean led by Ras Boanerges, Pashanti, and Bonga Time. In 1984, the first mission outside the Caribbean was led by Ras Boanerges and travelled to Toronto under the banner of Sons of Thunder. And in 1986, a delegation which included Ras Boanerges and Ras Historian travelled to London to participate in Rastafari Focus, a programme which held as part of a wider series of cultural events known as Caribbean Focus. All of these were path-breaking events which conferred a higher profile upon the House and the movement in general. A. Prelude to the Rainbow Circle Trods. The events noted above all occurred prior to the first mission to the United States in 1988, known as the Rainbow Circle Throne Room. I should point out that the House actually sent 2 delegations abroad as part of this mission. One to the West Coast, Los Angeles, and one to the East Coast, New York, DC, Baltimore. All of the trods noted have sought to raise the positive profile of the movement in other nations. While the 1988 mission to the US had this goal, it is also necessary to understand that it was also precipitated by the widespread crisis atmosphere which existed with Jamaica and Rastafari communities in the metropolitan United States. The context for this atmosphere was established in the early 1980s and can be traced to the installation of conservative governments in both the US and Jamaica with the Reagan and Seaga regimes, respectively. In the case of the Reagan administration, this atmosphere featured a general paranoid about immigration from the Caribbean and Latin America, increasing racial tension within the US society, and the targeting of certain ethnic groups for what was seen as an attack on the moral values of white Anglo-Saxon America. Drugs and those who disseminated them were seen as part of this scourge. By the mid-1980s, this mindset devoted considerable attention to Jamaicans and Colombians. In 1985, this led the United States Drug Enforcement Agents Administration to revive a program named Operation Buccaneer in Jamaica under the Seaga administration. The program earmarked $9 million for the destruction of ganja crop, mostly sowed by small planters attempting to supplement their income, operating helicopter sorties 5 days a week. According to the DEA, ganja formed a central part of the political economy of Jamaica, and they were bent on its eradication. The North American trade in ganja was also publicized in relation to the growth of Jamaican posses in the metropoles of the US, even though the latter, when apprehended, were more frequently indicted on cocaine charges. These associations, widely publicized in the press and media, formed the public context in which Jamaicans and even more critically Rastafarians found themselves viewed. B. Jamaican posses, the criminalization of Rastas and the DC community. During much of the 1980s, Rasta communities in the US found themselves under siege in large measure due to the media coverage and public hysteria being generated over the criminal activities of urban drug gangs known as the Jamaican posses. It was invariably the case that Rastafari was misrepresented and criminalized by the print and television media through the coverage associated with these gangs. See Appendix 2. Newspaper articles on posses appeared in nearly all the major metropolitan papers of the US. For example, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Washington Post, New York Times. Invariably, these articles implied a connection between posses and Rasta. In one instance, the national television news coverage and network, I believe it was CBS, sent a reporter to Kingston to do some background documentation. The reporter delivered his segment by positioning himself in front of a local reggae music shop, flanked on one side by a portrait of Bob Marley and on the other side a painting of Haile Selassie. He delivered his report on posses without ever mentioning Rastafari. The pictures behind him, however, implicitly linked Rasta to criminality in the public mind. In addition, Rastafari, i.e., Jamaican speaking dreadlocks, were increasing cast as urban terrorists in various popular action-orientated television series such as Miami Vice, Wise Guy, LA Law, and Mike Hammer. On one of the early Miami Vice episodes, the star Crockett, Don Johnson, was explaining to his partner Tubbs how his first partner died. The dialogue goes, Crockett, yeah, we were gaming, investigating some rusters. Tubbs, what happened? Crockett, well, we were gaming these rusters and the leader put 2 bullets in my partner's face. A Wise Guy episode of the same period opens with a camera shot over the shoulder to 3 dreadlocks on a rooftop with machine guns, apparently waiting to ambush someone coming down the street. As the hero comes down the street in his car and gets out, the dreads open fire. Most of the plot unfolds around the hero trying to escape from these thugs. All of these media flows had a powerful influence on stereotyping Rastas as violent urban criminals. This was a kind of misrepresentation and media irresponsibility which the DC Rasta community was attempting to counteract with the first delegation in 1988. C. Operation Caribbean Cruise and Coalition Against Caribbean Cruise. In the early dawn hours of February 6, 1986, the Jamaican and Rastafari community of Washington, D.C. was literally invaded by the largest police raid in the history of the District of Columbia. 500 Metropolitan Police stormed the community on that morning, expecting to arrest an indeterminate number of Rastafari who were hiding large caches of drugs and weapons. The raid proved essentially fruitless and located no significant drug traffic, particularly amongst local Rastafari. The publicity associated with the police action did, however, seek to criminalise local Rastafari. A copy of the DC Police Manual used to prepare officers for the operation was quoted as describing the Rastafari as members of a religious cult organized for the purpose of distributing narcotics in order to generate funds for the violent overthrow of the present Siaga Jamaican government. And as cultists who favor use of automatic and semi-automatic weapons, coupled with a willingness to use them under any circumstances. And that's as quoted by the Washington Post, page 18. 22386, see Appendix 3. The reaction of the local DC community resulted in righteous outrage and led to the formation of a grassroots coalition known as Coalition Against Operation Caribbean Cruise. It was led by Dara Tompkins, a Rastafari sisterin, and Russ Abraham Peddy, a community activist raised in England who later moved to the US, where he attended Howard University until the mid-1970s. See Appendix 2. Members of the local Rastafari community sought to protect themselves by countering the Johnny Too Bad gun-toting image, which the press had constructed of Rastafari. Efforts to educate the press based on so-called soundbite coverage of their culture could not possibly be effective. The climate of racial polarization and intolerance created by the Reagan administration at the time made this task all the more difficult. The community therefore resolved to assist a delegation of Nyabingi elders to carry the tradition forward in order to educate and edify the public at large, while at the same time to strengthen local brethren and sistren. After a prolonged period of planning and coordination necessary to cut through the Babylonian red tape, the mission, consisting of over 15 elders, including 2 elder sistren, arrived at John F. Kennedy International Airport on May 23, 1988. Among others, the mission included Russ Samuel Livermore Brown, Bonga Time, Bonga Tony, Bonga Bigger, Bonga Stephen Fraser, Bonga Peter Golding, Russ Ivo Wright, Russ Ibo Wright, Irie Irons, Bonga Joe, Aya V, Sister Bubbles, Sister Ina, Sister Esmin, and Russ Morris Clark. Mutabaruka accompanied the delegation to several venues, including their appearance at Howard University. 4. The Washington, D.C. and New York Rasta community and the Smithsonian's involvement. A. Organizing the Trod. Few members of the House are aware of manoeuvrings behind the scenes that were necessary to make the first Trod a reality. I outline some of these below. Although the proclaimed desire for a mission of elders from Jamaica was voiced by DC Rastas following the Caribbean cruise debacle in 1986, it would be another 2 years before the roadblocks of bureaucratic hassles were overcome and the proper groundwork between the House in Jamaica and the local DC community arranged. My involvement began about 2 months after the Caribbean cruise raid. I was contacted on separate occasions by two Rastafari, Sister Nzinga and Ras Simeon Heron, who had been put in touch with me by Sister Farika Burhan. Sister Farika and I were aware of each other through my groundings with the House in the early 1980s. This led to my involvement in a series of meetings with other community leaders, including Ras Abraham Peddy and Ras Michael McCullough. The DC Rasta community felt that a mission by members of the House would assist to educate the public about the culture and counter many of the negative stereotypes about Rastafari. In the course of my meetings with the local elders in Washington, D.C., it was agreed that I would attempt to secure visas for the elders through the Smithsonian Institution. As a quasi-agency of the United States government, we presumed the Smithsonian could ensure the necessary visas and cut through the magisterial dismissiveness which most Jamaicans, not to mention Rasta, would encounter at the US Embassy. There was, however, one problem. I had no formal authority or position within the Smithsonian which would allow me to obtain the visas. Allow me to digress here. In 1985, I received a postdoctoral fellowship in the Smithsonian's Department of Anthropology. This was based on a dissertation which I had written about Rastafari entitled The Ancients of Days Seated Black, Eldership and Oral Tradition in Rastafari Culture, as well as my continuing work with the movement. In order to support my family, I accepted a minor position on the staff of the institution's Human Studies Film Archives. This position hardly empowered me to sponsor a delegation of elders, something which even the DC brethren and sistren failed to realise. I had, however, developed a number of contacts within the institution, which enabled me to interest several of my colleagues in taking a closer look at Rastafari. One of these, Nick Spitzer, was sympathetic to my idea for a delegation. He had worked as a part-time DJ in Philadelphia in the early 1970s and had interviewed Bob Marley and the Wailers on his program. Our informal interest ultimately had to be fortified by persuading others to lend support to the idea if the trod was to become a reality. I lobbied my case for the Smithsonian support throughout the institution. A similar process was carried on outside the Smithsonian by Russ Abraham, Russ Mike McCullough, Sister Farika, and Russ Simeon Hera, who solicited letters of support from community organisations and others. I also networked the Jamaican embassy with Jamaican scholars and officials to secure letters of support for the delegation that would ultimately travel. Ultimately, the Smithsonian agreed to process the paperwork for the visas. The institution would not, however, provide financial assistance for the mission. In this, the DC Rasta community was on its own. This made it necessary to write a grant proposal to the DC Humanities Council for the funding. At the same time, this process also involved arranging venues for educational and cultural presentations and requesting letters of report for these presentations. The proposal included in this report was written primarily by myself, Sister Farika, and Ras Simeon Heron, with input from other members of the community. It defined the need for an elders trod, outlined the benefits which such a mission would bring to the community and the public at large, and identified a number of venues which had already agreed to host presentations or programs by the delegation. See Appendix 4. Ultimately, this project was funded in the modest amount of $1,500 US. The communities most concerned with the New York and Washington DC communities, found themselves very much in the position of feeding the multitudes from one small basket. These funds acquired from the DC Humanities Council were a mere pittance and could not even begin to cover the travel expenses involved. The enthusiasm for the trod amongst Rastafari in the DC and New York communities, however, was enormous. I believe that they regarded this as a more monumental event than the elders themselves. For the first time, many who sighted up Rasta outside the island of its birth would be coming face to face with the roots of their culture. Due to the generosity of the New York and DC community, funds were raised by individuals going into their pockets to cover the expenses of plane fares, lodging. Lodging was covered by brethren like Yaya in Baltimore, and meals were covered by the same generosity. B. Righteous Remnant or CIA spy. During April of 1988, I spent 3 weeks in Yard caucusing with members of the House who gathered from around the island. This involved me in the extended sessions of reasoning with the elders, both in separate yards in Kingston and elsewhere in the more formal settings at 133 Tower Street, the law office of Brother Miguel Lawn, which was used as a meeting place to stage the trod. I think it is fair to say that brethren and sistren within the House held highly divergent opinions of my involvement in the trod. And no doubt this range of opinions continues to exist with respect to my current movement. Many of those with whom I had grounded from 1980 onwards regarded me as a brethren and as a righteous remnant, doing the work of the Rastafari. Others clearly resented my presence, saw me as another academic opportunist, and regarded me as an unwanted interloper in Rasta business. Some of these were willing to plastic me to my face, use me for whatever they felt I could do, and discard me when convenient. Some clearly hoped that I would fall on my own sword. Others kept an open mind and were willing to judge me on the basis of my work. A few clearly felt that I was a CIA spy. One sister actually started the rumour that I had a strategy to infect the delegation with the AIDS virus. One of the ranking elders in the House publicly declared his displeasure with Russ Abraham and the Washington, D.C. community for sending a white man to represent them. Not only a white man, but a bald tail to boot. In this regard, it should be noted that the original plans were for Russ Abraham to represent the DC community in these final face to face negotiations with the House. At the 11th hour, for whatever reasons, he was unable to make the trip and I volunteered my services. In the swirl of these divergent perceptions, I became the focus for a number of public dramas played out for the benefit of the community. I saw these as responses to my alignment with certain elders within the House, to my academic and Smithsonian credentials, and as part of the customary testing that goes on among brethren and sistren. The idea that I was representing the Smithsonian, a quasi-agency within the US government, and the citadel of Babylon, clearly served to increase deliberation within its ranks about the merits of the trod. Some charged me with seeking to serve two masters. C. Finalizing the delegation list with a clean hands and a pure heart. One of the initial issues which had to be addressed in the obtaining of visas for the elders was to establish a list of who, in fact, would be on the delegation. In the course of attempting to establish this list, I came to fully appreciate the principle of acting with clean hands and pure heart. This came in part from being unexpectedly thrust into the role of representing the Washington, D.C. community with the House in Jamaica and having to deal in part with the logistical issues raised by the trod. This included addressing the issue of who was and who was not on the official list of elders that would constitute the delegation, and in dealing with the timing of approaching the US Embassy for the visas. Handling these issues gave me some insight into the inner workings of the House. There was, of course, no reason why I shouldn't have fulfilled these duties. After all, I was the individual who personally obtained the necessary paperwork to obtain the visas and had the necessary bureaucratic connections to make the process work. Neither Russ Abraham nor Miguel Lawn or any of the elders controlled this part of the process. What neither of these individuals was able to provide me with was an official list of who the House had selected for the trod. Prior to departing for Jamaica in April, Russ Abram was unable to provide me with such a list, even though he reportedly had been in close contact with Brother Miguel Lawn, the brethren in Jamaica, who had become de facto chairman of the House's selection committee. There was, according to Russ Abrams' word, a lot of jostling taking place amongst the elders to be named on the list. While he assured me that he had been in touch with Brother Miguel about who was on the list, he was rather vague about what, if any, selection criteria were being used to produce that list. He simply stated to me that if you can't dance in yard, you can't dance abroad. This was, at the best, a rather vague reference to being recognised as having ritual abilities within the House. When I arrived in yard and met with the House, no official list was forthcoming. After the first formal meeting at 133 Tower Street, Brother Miguel's law offices, it became clear that such a list would never be formulated. A few ranking elders like Russ Bowanerges and possibly Russ Sam Brown had probably been nominated and ratified by consensus of the House. Others, however, had just as clearly put their own names forward, hoping that they would withstand scrutiny by the House. And still others were probably being nominated by one or more of the factions that exist within the House. Whatever the case, nothing was settled by the time I arrived and began to attend meetings with the House. One thing was clear from my own point of view. I was there on a mission. My duty was to ensure that a list was drafted and that visas were obtained for everyone on that list before I left Jamaica, Selassie. However, this was handled. Critics would surely argue that I unduly meddled in the process. My only course was to act with a clean hand and pure heart, observe principles of collective security, and trust in Jah. I had 3 weeks in Jamaica to resolve these issues, after which time it was necessary that I return to Washington. Let me digress here to make a point about how I had decided to deal with the house. In the first week of my trip to Jamaica, I made contact with a US consular representative in Jamaica, in Kingston, who, through prior arrangement with the Smithsonian, was providing special paperwork for the visas under the umbrella of a USIA cultural exchange program. There would have been no mission without this paperwork. With the paperwork in hand, I was faced with a decision. Should I control the paperwork as security in case the selection process broke down? If I did, I was at least assured of being able to obtain visas for the 15 individuals who, if need be, I could handpick. Or should I turn over the USIA paperwork to the de facto chairman of the selection committee, Brother Miguel Lawn? I believe that, for better or for worse, the House had to collectively work through this process by itself. A heavy hand by someone perceived as an outsider would have hopelessly compromised matters. As it turned out, enough heat was generated over my involvement. Although I have some mixed feelings about having turned over the paperwork to Brother Miguel, this was the proper course. The point I wish to make, however, is that my decision more or less enabled him to control how events would unfold from that point forward, especially as to when the delegation would move to the embassy. Brother Miguel remained vague about when a definitive list would be drafted and when the move to the embassy would be made. This created a number of problems for those who were positioning themselves for a place on the mission, especially those elders who had to trot in from country. They were being held hostage by the process. If they returned to their yards, they might forfeit a place on the delegation. To remain in town, they had to hustle and live off their social credit with others. Ultimately, matters came to a head when the brethren and sistren with whom I was dealing with at Church Street, a number of these elders, like Pa Shanti, Bonga Townie, Bonga Biga, Sister Aina, and Bonga Stefan, had come from country and found it necessary to cotch there, waiting for Miguel to announce the date for the embassy move. There was considerable grumbling amongst this group, and a number of whom I was forced to support out of my own pocket while we waited. I was of the opinion that Miguel was seeking to wait me out. Once the date for my return to DC passed, he could assume control of the process himself. I resolved this would not be the case. D. Prophetic signs. An event at Church Street brought things to a head. I was in the final week of my stay and the visa impasse had not been resolved. The resolution of these matters came through the power of the Father himself. One afternoon, while seated in a reasoning at the Church Street, an earthquake, which registered prophetically 5.5 on the Richter scale, struck Kingston. The memory is still vivid in my mind. At first, there was a low rumbling, rising in tempo, which my mind sought to process. I initially registered it as a train pulling into a station, and then I realized that we were miles from the railway. Cries of Aitzquay, Fireburn, and Rastafari made clear the source of these vibrations as the brethren and sistren in the yard began yanting ices. This was unmistakably a prophetic sign. On this overcast day and the dreary day, another confirming sign followed. After the earthquake, myself and a group of about 5 or 6 brethren resolved to march to Brother Miguel's law office to insist that the embassy move take place immediately. As the decision was collectively ratified, a single beam of sunlight, about 3 feet in diameter, broke through the overcast guy and enveloped this small group. I recall looking at Bonga Bigger and Bonga Tani at the moment and seeing their locks transformed into electric antennae by the late afternoon rays of light. This was the seal. Off we marched to Russ Miguel's offices at 133 Tower Street. When we arrived, Brother Miguel was out of the office. He later said that I had cursed and insulted his secretary, a charge which led to a public row between Miguel and myself before an assembly of brethren and sistren in his law offices the following year. In any event, this precipitated a move to the embassy 2 days later. When I arrived there was yet another fortuitous sign. The US consular agent assigned to our group had a friendly nature and an appropriate name, Mr. Daniel Roots. A similar sign taken to confirm the blessing of His Majesty would be apparent at the delegation's first venue at Howard University in Washington, D.C., when the delegation made their presentation at the Blackburn Center. Arrangements had already been put in place through the Smithsonian Office of International Affairs to provide paperwork for 15 elders. Despite this official limit, an additional 16 individuals travelled en masse to the US Embassy on the day when visas were to be obtained. 26 persons eventually received visas to enter the United States. 2 delegations actually travelled. A large group embarked for New York, which included a group of 15 officially covered by the Smithsonian paperwork, along with other individuals like Mutabaruka, Ras Ayavi, and 1 or 2 others. A smaller group, which included Pa Ashanti, Ras historian Russ Rose, and a few others, travelled to Los Angeles. I left Jamaica satisfied that Selassie I had guided my movements. These charts were both divine missions and historic events which were conducted under strict Nyabingi protocol. Of the 15 elders nominated by the House, only 2, Russ Sam Brown and Bonga Watto, had ever travelled abroad to North America. Both were historic figures within the movement, with somewhat different orientations to the Rastafari liberty. Rassam was the first Rasta for a seat, for a seat in the Jamaican Parliament, a highly controversial move given the traditional political stance of the Rastafari. Many respect his intellectual abilities and outspoken views. Bonga Watto is the ubiquitous presence at Nyabingi, a patriarch respected for his oratory and ritual abilities as a priest within the churchical order of the house. He is known for his disciplined and uncompromising position on the issues of liberty. Even though Bonga Watto had gone with the group to the embassy and secured a visa, he chose for whatever reason not to travel with the delegation. As a result, Rassam Brown came to serve as the ranking elder and principal spokesman for the mission during its official presentations abroad. F. Other notable events. There were a number of significant events in my movements with elders who eventually departed on the 1988 mission, which should be more publicly known within the House. The first of these involved a day-long reasoning between several elders, Bonga Time, Bonga Shefan, Tani, Bigger, and Sister Aina, and a group of Howalites at Salt River, Hill 60. I had been made aware of this group by Sister Farika Burhan, who, along with Russ E.P. Macpherson, had visited them around 1982. On the eve of the first Nyabingi mission to the United States, this was an historic meeting between the custodians of 2 different roots tradition within Rastafari, those from the Divine Order of the Nyabingi and the remnants of Leno Howell's Ethiopian Salvation Society, who were resident at Pinnacle. For their part, these remnants of Howell's commune at Pinnacle, Mother White, Brother Rupert White, and Sister Audrey, were keen to learn about the house's imminent trod abroad and to be remembered as a foundational point of Rastafari culture and resistance. During an all-day session of reasoning, the historic role of the Nyabingi House was confirmed by Brother Rupert and Sister Audrey, who stated that Howell had once told his followers that they had better sit firm in their seats because there would be a set of people, dreadlocks, coming after them to take their seat. The day was filled with upful reasoning and an unprecedented mix of both Bingi chants from the elders and Kumina Bailo and Ethiopian Salvation Society chants from the Howellites. The traces of an historic circle had been joined and strengthened on that day. During that visit, a tape recorded the reasonings of the Howellites and the elders as well as most of the chanting. Approximately 2 years ago, I made those audio tapes available to Russ E.P. McPherson. His plan at the time was to use the tapes along with tapes he had recorded during an earlier visit to the Howellites to produce a musical CD under the title Kulunga. That CD is now complete. To my knowledge, it was done exclusively at his personal expense and under his authorship. This CD now provides contemporary Rastafari with a rarely glimpsed side of the earliest roots tradition of the Rastafari. Those happenings were all a prelude to the first official trot of the house to the United States. The following year, I would also be involved in another trot which brought some of the same elders to the Smithsonian to participate in the Festival of American Folklife. Both of these trods travelled under the banner of the Rainbow Circle Throne Room of Jarastafari. Described below are a number of the significant events associated with each of these missions. V. The Washington, D.C. connection and subsequent missions abroad. A. The first Rainbow Circle Throne Trod. The first trod was received in New York at the Universal Rastafari Movement Center in Harlem, where it was received by, amongst others, Prince Dewitt and the president of the Brooklyn chapter of the UNIA. Videotape documentation was made of this historic reception and is currently at the Smithsonian. 1. The first venue at which the elders presented in Washington, D.C. was in the Blackburn Center at Howard University. This was entirely fitting for a number of reasons. Howard University is a predominantly black institution. His Imperial Majesty sent Malaku Bayan to Howard for education prior to charging him with organising and establishing the Ethiopian World Federation. Professor Abby Ford teaches at Howard. Professor Ford is the son of Mignon Ford, the musical director for Marcus Garvey's UNIA. It was the senior Ford who authored the anthem, the Ethiopian national anthem, which is sung today at Nyabingi celebrations. Finally, Emperor Selassie personally visited Howard at the same time that he attended John F. Kennedy's funeral in Washington, D.C. He deposited, at that time, several religious icons and Ethiopian artifacts, which became part of the Moreland Spingarn collection curated by Professor Thomas C. Battle. Dr. Battle hosted the elders during their program at Howard University. See Appendix 4. 2. A number of other venues followed. These included Johns Hopkins University, Southeastern University, the International Center of the Smithsonian Institution, and African Liberation Day, again on the Howard University campus. Videotape documentation of all these events are presently in the collection of the Human Studies Film Archives, Smithsonian Institution. The Smithsonian's Folklife program also audiotaped all of the elders' presentation at the International Center and holds tapes of these. In addition, Nick Spitzer and another Folklife associate traveled with me to Baltimore during the first week of the elders' arrival there. There was some brief interviewing was done. It was originally hoped that this taping would provide the basis for a program on Radio Smithsonian promoting the Elders Tour in the Eastern United States. Ironically, this was sabotaged by a number of the elders and some of the DC community activists with whom I attempted to coordinate. In retrospect, it is clear that an elders program of this size, especially one with the involvement of any outside organisation, will be fraught with problems. Many of these problems derive from the inability of the group to reach agreement over specific agendas. In some cases, as in this example, the group becomes its own worst enemy. 3. The second trot came in June-July of 1989 when and was arranged through the Office of Folklife Program, Smithsonian Institution. I've heard some drop that the Smithsonian Institution arranged for and paid for that trot, and it is even generally assumed by some of those on the mission that the Smithsonian called for the elders, again because they wished them to perform at the Folklife Festival. Let me set the record straight. B. The second Rainbow Circle Throne Room Trot. In 1989, the Office of Folklife had planned a Caribbean venue for the festival, at which they wished to showcase several African Caribbean traditions. To this end, they sent representatives to Cuba to arrange for Santeria and Palo Monte groups representing Yoruba and Congo culture, respectively. They also made arrangements to bring a Vaudon troupe from Haiti and performers from Puerto Rico and Jamaica as well. In the Jamaican case, they had already established a working relationship with Olive Lewin, who it was assumed would travel for a Maroon Kumina Etu groups to travel to DC. Through negotiations with Miss Lewin, however, it became clear that she was not interested in assisting a Rastafari delegation to travel abroad. At this point, the Folklife program was prepared to proceed without a Rasta presence at the festival. I had my own working relationship with colleagues at Folklife, and I argued that it would be impossible to mount a credible program on African Caribbean culture without Rastafari present. A number of my Folklife colleagues agreed, and after some negotiations, I spent a month in Jamaica, part of which time was spent organising a second delegation. During this time, I generated some videotape of chanting and drumming shot in Bongo Stefan's yard, as well as some videotape of Pa Ashanti's in Sister Ina's yard. The latter tape was shot 2 days before Pa unexpectedly passed away. There was, however, a key problem with the format of the Folklife Festival, which I felt was not appropriate for an elder's mission. This was not so much the format of the festival itself as the logistics of how festival participants were restricted in their movements once they arrived in Washington, D.C. That is, it is customary for participants to be housed collectively in a nearby hotel, more or less under the supervision of designated handlers. This type of restriction was unworkable and not befitting the dignity of the elders as international ambassadors. The primary purpose of the trot was not simply to make a series of formal presentations at the festival, something I felt would further build upon the positive profile of Rastafari established the year before, but to connect and network with the adjacent communities of the Rastafari in DC, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and beyond. As a trade-off for being unencumbered and for being granted visas which extended beyond the period of the festival itself, something that was not done for any other participants, it was necessary for myself and the local Rastafari community to raise funds to cover travel and lodging. Most of the funds were covered by a single individual, Russ Morris Clark. I covered the cost of 2 tickets. Lodging, as in the previous year, was supported by brethren and sistren in the community. 1. High points. There was a notable event which occurred on the final day of the festival when the paramount king of Ghana's Ga people paid an impromptu visit to the festival and toured the Caribbean venue with his full entourage. Only two of the festival organisers were aware of the visit, and one of these had made special arrangements with Colonel Harris, the leader of Jamaica's Moortown Maroons, to receive the Gar King in the Jamaican dancing boat at the end of his tour through the compound. It was generally thought that this would provide an historic moment both for the King's entourage and the Maroons, insofar as the latter trace much of their Chromanti culture to Ghana and the Ashanti heritage. As Jah would have it, this event never took place. When the Gar King finished his tour, Colonel Harris was elsewhere at the time. Settling themselves under a large elm tree, the king and his retinue found themselves face to face with the Nyabingi delegation, which, ironically, had been forced to cotch under the tree for most of the festival. Let me point out that, unlike all the other group invited to the festival, the Rastas were not given a special resting place. Rather, they found themselves symbolically marginalized in the festival space among other Jamaicans and Caribbean participants. Once again, prophecy ruled. The stone that the builder refused became the head cornerstone. In an impromptu ceremony, the king greeted each of the brethren and sistren in turn. The elders then took up their drums and escorted the king and his group into the boat and began to chant Bingi in his honor. They opened with the chant, Closer than a brother. In turn, the elders were honored by a blessing from the king's high priest. All of this is documented on video now in the HSFA collections. 2. I will simply list in order the other high points of this trot. Point A. Following the Folklife Festival, the elders trod to New York where they were featured in the African Street Festival in July. Point B. Later that month, the remaining core group of elders opened the Washington, D.C. Reggae Fest with a session of Nyabingi chanting and oratory. They were also featured in a full-length article in the city paper, Washington's alternative newspaper, Appendix 6. Point C. In July, the group travelled to Chicago to participate in an event celebrating the King's birthday, July 23rd. They became the first Nyabingi presence in Chicago and appeared on several radio programs. This event was organised by Sister Kate. In the aftermath of these events, a number of elders remained in the United States. This included Bongo Shefan, Pido, and Marcus, along with Ras Morris Clark, who had remained there from the previous trot. These individuals came to form the core of the Washington and Baltimore Rasta communities. Ultimately, Russ Marcus went on to organize a series of annual African Family Day celebrations in Baltimore and to become something of a community activist through his organization Ancestors Roots. Bonga Shefan, who had also remained in Baltimore for a time, relocated to Atlanta, Georgia, where he became the focus of that community. 6. Events in 1990 and 1991. The missions of 1988 and 1989 were successful enough to the point that they were convinced that at least one other conservative institution, the American Museum of Natural History in New York, that had a similar Rastafari program, should be mounted on their part. Because people there knew of my involvement with the Rainbow Circle Throne Room Trods, I was contacted by the director of their Department of Education to see if I would be interested in assisting them to organise a Nyabingi program in May of 1990. See Appendix 7. I agreed to this. On the museum side, I worked with Ishmael Caladron and Evangeline Kim, who networked with the New York community. On the Rasta side, I worked with Russ Morris Clark, Monga Shefan, and Pajak Hewitt, a former member of Russ Michael and the Sons of Negus, to organise this program. We also made arrangements for Ras Headful to travel from Jamaica to participate in the event. About 2 weeks prior to the event, Bongatani and Bonga Bigga travelled on their own initiative from Jamaica to participate. Russ Michael of the Sons of Negus joined the program in New York and participated in the event as well. This became the first Rastafari program to be funded by a New York State Council of the Arts. The program was entitled Rastafari Beats of the Heart, Rhythms of Resistance. Prior to the event, the elders were approached by Russ Stafford Ashanti, the host of a New York-based television program called Reggae Strong. Stafford requested and received permission from them to videotape the event for the stated purpose of airing some of the tape on his program. It was agreed, however, that he would provide the elders with a full copy of the videotape which he shot of the event. To my knowledge, none of this material was ever aired on television, nor did the elders or the American Museum of Natural History ever receive copies of the tape shot by Stafford. See Appendix A. In August of 1980, the elders made a presentation at the Organization of American States, OAS, in Washington, D.C., where they met with several ambassadors, chanted Bingi, and presented poetry and oratory. I videotaped various parts of the program, including scenes of the elders backstage in the meeting chamber of the OAS. This tape is currently in the Human Studies Film Archives, Smithsonian. Subsequently, 7 of the elders, Bungo, Shefan, Tawny, Bigger, Marcos, Pido, Russ Headful, and Sister Bubbles, associated themselves with an American-born Rasta sistrin, Sister Malika Sojourner Alcindor, to produce a record of Nyabingi chants and oratory. This was produced jointly by Sister Malika and Dr. Dredd, Gary Himmelfarb, the owner of Rust Records in Washington, D.C., and released under the title Rastafari Elders. For the record, I've included the frontispiece and inner and liner notes as part of this document. I wish to make clear that I took no part in this production and it was initiated completely by the elders and Sister Malika. Bongo Pido, who remains in Washington, D.C., went on to produce another CD with Russ Records entitled Modern Antique. Russ Headful relocated to Atlanta, where he is currently resident. Finally, I note one event held in 1991 in which I was associated. This was entitled The Lion and the Lamb. It was an evening presentation of Rastafari philosophy, chanting, and oratory sponsored by Anacostan Museum of the Smithsonian Institution. It featured a presentation by Russ Sam Brown and involved most of the elders from the DC community, including Russ Abraham, Ross Morris Clark, Pa Jack, as well as Russ Ibo Wright, who just happened to be passing through DC at the time. The entirety of this event was videotaped by the Anacostia Museum. A copy of the program is on deposit in the Human Studies Film Archives, Smithsonian. See Appendix 9. This program was part of a prelude to an exhibit entitled The Black Mosaic, which sought to generate public understanding about the diversity of African culture in the DC area. This exhibit had a Rasta presence as well. All of these public programming initiatives have gone a long way toward raising the profile of Rastafari in New York, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and Philadelphia communities, as well as elsewhere in North America. They have also helped to consolidate Rastafari communities in these locations by providing them with a small core of elders around whom the community can network and organize. In all of these sites, Nyabingi ceremonies have become a part of the annual calendar of Rasta life. I have included copies of various flyers disseminated mostly by the Washington, D.C. community announcing these celebrations. See Appendix 10. Concluding remarks. Let me offer a few concluding to the House based on some of the arguments I've heard since 1988. First, I wish to make it clear that I became involved in these initiatives for only one reason: to assist the elders to disseminate the truth about Rastafari and to help dispel the misinformation which continues to circulate about I culture and traditions. I am confident that righteousness exalts a nation, whatever colour they may be, whatever creed they may profess. This is the part of the Father's work. Second, in offering myself to the House in this regard, I have never had financial considerations in mind. The truth cannot be sold. This is one of the primary reasons why I have consistently refused to become involved in any kind of commercial endeavour with the House or with individual brethren or sistren. I have no problem assisting individuals to help themselves economically. I am not and will not, however, be an agent for the House or for any individuals. I draw attention to these points because of the kind of sounds that I hear drop from time to time, namely that I have become big off Rasta, that I have made millions for either myself or the Smithsonian. This is not only nonsense, and the House as a whole needs to get in touch with reality with respect to these kinds of things. These kinds of fantasies are counterproductive for the House, especially at a time when it is seeking to become a bona fide international organisation. By my own estimation, my involvement in these international trods has cost me several thousands of dollars out of my own pocket, as well as the volunteering of my personal time and skills. When I returned to Yard in 1989, the year after the first trot, I was confronted by some brethren who claimed that each participant in the trot was supposed to have made 77,000 US dollars. Similar nonsense was broadcast about those who participated in the Folklife Festival. Only a fool leans on this type of misunderstanding. Rastafari in Yard need to understand that it is only the generosity of Rastafari brethren and sistren abroad which have made some of these trods possible. Most have gone into their own pockets to assist the elders to travel. Similarly, many went into their own pockets to give them money with which they could return to Jamaica. Regardless of what people may think, money does not grow on trees in America. One has to earn it. Those in Yard need to appreciate this fact. Those in Yard also need to understand that Rastafari communities abroad have many of the same internal divisions as does the House in Yard. This is a reality that needs to be kept in mind as the Nyabingi House moves forward in the international process. I've heard it said by one elder that the House is basically on the training wheels when it comes to its ambassadorial qualifications. This is to say that it needs to become more collective with respect to dealing with people like myself or with community organisers abroad who may have their own agendas in promoting the House or the movement in general. In closing, the House should be more aware that in March 1995, during the course of videotaping the Earthstrong Nyabingi of Russ Earlights in Cypress Hall, I reasoned with the assembled elders, brethren, and sistren about this report. Those present included Ross Bunga Time, Ross Wakai, Bunga Shefan, Bunga Lloyd, Earlights, Bunga Tani, Russ Soji, Russ Lulu, Sister Aina, Sister Daphne, Russ Witterdred, and several other elders with whom I am familiar only through their countenance. At that time, I left a preliminary compilation of documents associated with the 1988-89 trods in the hands of Russ Witterdred in his capacity as an elect of records. I promised at that time to go forward to my gates, prepare a more in-depth report, which I now have in hand, and forward this report to the House of Scots Pass, Manchester, in care of the Supreme Council. Subsequently, the full report was issued to Bonga Time, Russ Ivi, Russ Wakai, The report will similarly be available to the Washington, D.C. community and will be made so to other communities that may request it. From such time unto this time, One Heart, Jakes Hoviat, 5812 La Vista Drive, Alexandria, Virginia, 22310. Director, National Anthropological Archives, National Museum of Natural History, 10th Street and Constitution Avenue, Smithsonian Institution, Washington, D.C., 20560.